Praise be to God, there is no other God except God. If you watch movies about very ancient history before Christ, you can notice that generally the movies will portray one army or one nation as the good nation and the other one as the bad nation. And according to movie logic, the whole world in the past consisted of definitely good nations and definitely bad nations, kind of split in half. However, the reality is different. Before Christ, there were three groups of people. The only good nation were the children of Israel, and all the other nations were bad nations, except for the Greeks and the Romans, who were neither bad, neither good, neutral. And usually other nations were neutral only in passing, while they transitioned from bad to good or from good to bad. But the ancient Greeks and Romans were long-term neutral nations. And by neutral, I mean between good and evil. And their neutrality between good and evil stemmed from the fact that the Greeks and the Romans discovered democracy, which in the Roman version was called a republic. Democracy and republic fundamentally mean the same thing, with minor differences. Democracy in Greek means the rule of the people, and republic in Latin means from the people. Basically, the idea is that the final decision is not made by the king, but by the people. Now, because the other nations were kingdoms, the will of the king was the will of the nation. And if the king was a bad person, his will prevailed. And the whole nation was forced to be bad. Or good individuals were forced to leave. And if the king was a good person, because the will of the king ruled, the nation was forced to be a good nation. And the bad individuals were pressured to leave. So only true kingdoms can be good or bad. But true democracies are always neutral. So in a democracy, the will of all the people is the will of the nation. And because statistically, chances are that you will get the same proportion of good and bad people as there are in the whole world, then the good and the bad people are in balance. Actually, there are 10 times as many bad people as there are good people, but because a good deed produces 10 times as good results as a bad deed produces bad results, in that case, a nation which consists of a ratio of 10 people to any good person is in a balance between good and evil. Equal, good and evil, neutral. Now, of course, because the nations do not rule every aspect of our lives, it still allows for individual variations, to have good and bad people within that same state. But the common will of the whole nation, any democratic nation, is always equally good and evil. And this neutrality of the will of the nation has happened only twice in history. The first case is during the ancient Greeks and Romans, which happened from around the 5th century before Christ until just before Christ. And the second time that this happened is in our times, starting with the US Constitution in US and the French Revolution in Europe, which happened within a few years. Now, because democracies are stochastic systems and not specific events, they can be quite predictable, and we can use the democracies of the past to predict what will happen with democracies of today. So what happened to democracies of the past? They ultimately turned into an oligarchy, and then after a few complots and schemes and murders, they turned into a tyranny or empire with an emperor. And at the end of that, the Messiah came. And if you've been wondering why did God send Jesus at that time, it is to tell us when the Messianic age will come. So the Messiah came first after democracies ended, as soon as they turned into a tyranny. And this is to tell us that the Messianic age will come after these democracies will turn into a tyranny. And you might say, how do we know that democracies will turn into tyranny again? Well, actually, the first time they did not have to, but this time they have no other choice. Here is why. As I told you, the bad nations cause problems. The good nations solve problems, but democracies have this weird feature. They simply postpone problems. They don't solve them, they don't cause them, they just postpone them. That's how the system is built. If a person who is elected in a democracy tries to solve a problem, he will have to cause suffering initially among the people. And they will outvote him out of the government. And if he causes problems, again they will outvote him. So the best option, and very often the only option, for any elected official is to find a way to change things in such a way to simply postpone that problem, while on the surface appearing to have solved it, and leave it to the next elected official to solve it, who will again not solve it, but simply postpone it. Now, eventually, these problems from all sides will face one another, and postponing one of them will mean directly facing the other, and vice versa. And all the problems eventually will gather to one ultimate point, and there is no way to postpone them anymore. At that point, people will see that democracy is not useful anymore, and they will rather choose technocracy, which will lead to tyranny, to avoid the problems just a little bit more. And so they will go from the frying pan into the fire. And the final solution is to blame the believers, and the world will end, and the Messianic age will come. Now, why does the Messiah come after democracies? Well, it's because the Messianic age is a system of governance, and people are led to try all methods of governance to show that while Satan is there, there's no way you can make it work, no matter how you try it. And then democracies are simply a way to show that not only a certain king could not solve the problems of the people, but if all the people were involved into the decision making, the problems would still exist. And once and for all, it will be proven that involving all the people and all their efforts, which is the culmination of democracy, it will still not solve the human problems. Death and suffering will still exist for as long as evil people and Satan are involved. And after all attempts fail, then God sends the Messiah to tell us which is the only clean attempt which works. And the only attempt which works is to fully listen to God's word. And the Messiah is a representation of God's word. And only then can we have peace on earth without problems. Of course, this will not happen before 2280. And by the way, what I just explained is explained in a few words in the Quran. The Quran in the Arabic says in Surah 30 verses 2 through 4, the Romans have been defeated in the land of this lowest world. But after the defeat, they will rise again within several years. The command belongs to God before it and after it, twice. And that day will rejoice the believers. Now these verses have 7 meanings, but what I explained in this sermon is the most important meaning, because it is the overarching meaning. It covers all the other meanings. This meaning does not explain one specific event about the Romans. It's a description of all of history of the Roman Republic, who were a democratic community. So here it is actually talking about the democracy as well. So these verses are telling us all the history of democracy in the past and the future. So democracy existed before, and then it ended, and now it has come back again, and it will end again just a few years before the end of the world. And this is all the history of democracy, if we had to say it in 2 sentences. And each time after democracies go bad and end, God sends the Messiah. The first time to suffer, so that he can deserve to be the most prominent human in the next world. And the second time to fulfill that already earned prominence, so that God can show the world what is the perfect system of governance.